Well, good morning and welcome to our third session on the series that we're doing called The Configuration of Grace. Well, it's a privilege for me. My name is Suresh Guna and I represent a spiritual family, or some people would like to call it church, but this is a family of churches throughout the world called Pneuma Global Family. And again, it's a privilege for me this morning to continue in the third session of Configuration of Grace. And remember, for those who have followed us, the very first session that we did, it was about, we basically talked about, or I talked about, the 7 names and titles given to the church. Of course, we are the church. And I explained that all the 7 titles relates to the identity, the existence, how we exist, and also it relates to how we function. So basically, while giving us name, is like when you say this is a chair, you're basically saying that it is something that people can sit on. And if you say this is a table, then it actually defines the role and the function of it. The same way we looked at the 7 names, and all of them are very important for those who have not heard the first part. And remember also that the first 2 sessions, I did 30 minutes each session, but I've noticed that can become a little bit tiring for those who need a quick understanding on something. So I will compress a lot of information, but also pray that God will impart a lot of grace beyond what I'm saying. So from this point on, from the third session, we will do only 20 minutes session. And if those who are hungry and want to listen to more, then you can listen to 2 or 3 sessions, which will be then 1 hour. So the second part, I talked about the whole principle of headship. And I explained how headship is important because we talked about the oil is poured on the head before it descends on every part of the robe. And robe, remember, in the Bible, when a priest used to dress in his robe, he was ready now to function, and he was activated, and he also activated in turn God's grace, God's mercy, heaven, on behalf of those to whom he ministered to. So we looked at that, and we started to look at Christ being the head of the creation, guarantees that the creation is taken care of, things like rain and everything else. Secondly, we explained also that Christ is the head of men. Therefore, every man, every father, you can go to God and say, God, help me and give me. If you don't have a job and if you don't have a way to sustain you, you can go to God because he has appointed you to be the head. And thirdly, we looked at also how headship is a system by which grace flows. So when God says man is the head of the woman and Christ is the head of men, it doesn't indicate the old patriarchal mentality, even though patriarch is a very good word. It speaks of governance, of spiritual mantle that a person wear, that establishes nation and government, and we don't have time to really talk about that. But headship is a system of grace, is a pipeline, is something that flows. It can stop the flow, like a tap can be closed or it can open, but there is water in the pipeline. So all that. So we looked at that, and of course we looked at even Christ submitted himself to his father and to his mother. So in a house you got the father who is the head, and the mother joining together with the father becomes, both of them, the head of the children, or the pipeline of grace to the children. So the children, it is recommended by God or commanded by God that children obey their parents, not just the father who is the head of the woman, of the mother, but also to the parents, rather mother and father. And also we looked at, I'm just capturing again some of the thoughts. We looked at the definition of grace. And what we did in that is, if you want to listen a little bit more, you will see definition as the etymological definition, the word. And we looked at how it was used, the historical definition, the way the Greek used to use it about 4,000 years ago, or 4,500 years ago, taking into account about 2,000 years before Christ. And also we looked at the other definition, which is divine sufficiency, meaning that grace is a spiritual, heavenly, weightless or weightless material, which is dynamic, powerful, and God's omnipotence flows through it, meaning that it can achieve things that humanly it is impossible to be done. And today we're going to look at a third definition of grace. And the third definition of grace is, firstly, we said that grace is unmerited favor, which is a theological definition, and the nuance of it is found in the original Greek language, which dates back to about 2,500 years before Christ, or before the apostle that used it so much, like Paul himself. But now we're going to look at how grace is not just unmerited favor, is not just divine sufficiency, meaning that if God gives you a mandate and you are in no position of doing that mandate, meaning that you don't have the financial resources, you don't have the contacts, the people, you're in a bad context and environment which make it impossible, God will still make it possible for you. How? By grace. So it's called divine sufficiency. And I was giving an example that grace changes depending on who is before. And now we're looking at grace, meaning that some people, let me just go ahead of myself and say that God has a design, a purpose for each one of you, each one of us. And remember that the grace that we have, the Bible says, and we will look at it, if not in this session, in the next session, that the grace we have is given by measure. And when God gives you a mandate in life, that mandate, I've said that quite often, that mandate is always longer than your lifespan, and it is bigger than your life or everything that you will ever put together to make it happen. Meaning that humanly, it is impossible for you to do everything that God asks you to do. So what do we do in that case? We need to access people that God has put in our lives as spiritual fathers, as older brothers, as far off connection, like a spiritual uncle, if that ever existed, so that you can empower yourself. But I think it's rather more of a spiritual father, and that's where a spiritual father comes in. So we're gonna look at that way grace. But just before I do that, I would like to take a few minutes and explain to you or reinforce the idea that grace is more than unmerited favor. Grace is actually something material. And if it had weight, you would be able to weigh on a weight. You could weigh it. You could see how many gram or kilogram or what it is. So it is very important. All right, so today we're going to start by reading John chapter 1 verse 14. So grace is not just the disposition of God's heart, but is a heavenly material. Just like I can touch this glasses, I can do things, I can maneuver, I can open the glass so that I can wear it. I can do all that. And the reason I can do that is because it is a reality, something that is real. The same way, grace is not just a favor, unmerited favor, undeserved favor of God, in our lives, but it is also a material. It is divine sufficiency. So let's reinforce that. Let's look at John chapter 1 verse 14. All right, so it says here, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." So it is very clear here that the Word, which is the eternal Logos of God, Christ himself, became flesh. It transited eternity into time. It transited the immaterial and to the material, visible world. And it dwelt among us, meaning that it lived, experienced everything that human experienced. And then it says, "And we, in response to his dwelling, we beheld his glory." We saw his glory. We could gaze upon. We could see it. And he says, "The glory as of the only begotten of the Father." The only one could have come out of the Father. And he says he was full of grace and truth. So there's two things here that I want to reconcile. Number one, Christ, if you could imagine a bottle, a plastic bottle with water inside. So if you open the bottle and you pour it, what comes out is water. The same way Christ, even though he had a physical body, if you could open Christ, inside there is nothing but grace. And we can say that by that fact, because he was full of grace, we can say that God's composition is internal mass. Let me repeat that. God's internal mass, or let's call it the divine internal mass. What is that? Divine mass is what if you pile it together, it's God. If everything of divine mass, nothing is left there, everything is here, it becomes God, right? It becomes the person that create everything. There is nothing limited to him. Now, it says here, "And we saw his glory." And the word glory there is the word doxa. And the word doxa means weight. It means reputation of God. We saw his reputation, but we saw also his weight. And the weight of his presence. So meaning that if you take that word weight and you take about him being full of grace, what was inside that's what constitutes the weight. So the glory of God is a weight of God, is a grace, is a composition of God in manifestation. So whenever you see the glory of God appearing in Ezekiel, it's a composition of God appearing. So he was full. And if you can say the composition of God equal to grace, right? And when we receive grace, we live by it. So we live by God. That's what we can say. All right, the word full is the word pleres, and it means a few things. It's simple definition. It means full to the point of satisfied. It's like somebody who was hungry and he eats the first plate and he feel like, you know what, I can still eat a little bit more. Then he eat the second plate and he says, wow, now I'm full. If I eat anything, I will throw it up. So basically the word means satisfied. Nothing more can be given or eaten. The same way, it's like a cup of water. It's so full that if one drop surplus falls into it, it will overflow. And that's what it means. So Christ was full of grace. Full of grace. Now I would like to read another verse. And this verse is found also, it's actually the after two verses, we'll find it in John chapter 1, verse 16 to 17. We're still defining grace, remember? 16 to 17, and it says, of his fullness. Now remember, we just read, he was full, to the point of overflowing. And what he was full of, that composition which is, when it is manifested, it is glory, but it is a weight. It is called grace. He was full of grace. So of that fullness of grace, we have received, as you read it, you will see, grace upon grace. So there is nothing, it's not grace and something else. It's grace upon grace, grace on top of grace. And we're receiving grace because he is full of the grace. That's amazing. It's amazing, right? And it says, for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Now, grace is a heavenly material, the substance of God, or the substance God uses to build up or build us up in the image of God, and it is not of this world. So you will see that in Ephesians chapter 4, and as we go further, we'll go deeper and deeper and deeper, and we'll discover what is grace. And I'm telling you, if you start to understand these things, your life will change. Your life will be more fuller, more powerful, more functional, more dependent of God. There will be more grace in your life, more power to achieve things. It's just amazing. I started to understand this, how by grace, what we can do. And I know how to connect to other people that have higher grace and live under their shadows so that grace can flow, not under their dictatorship. And that has been always the conclusion, but it is not. It is under their shadows. So we will learn what it is to live with grace, meaning the grace that we have, and under grace, that means the people that God has brought in our lives to give us leadership and to cover us with grace. But make sure that you are under grace and not just under some so-called human leadership that don't provide grace or doesn't provide grace. All right, so I'm going to read something else, and I'm going to make a statement here. So we're looking at Christ was full of grace, and out of that fullness we have received grace upon grace, and that is what makes life better. Now, let me say something. Today's, according to my analysis and evaluation, I can tell you that people have all kind of structures within which they live, but not many people live in grace. So there's a poverty, and we will look at some other things later, but there's a poverty in the church, and that poverty is a poverty of grace. But I'm going to read something, and it is in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 8, and it says, and God is able. Wow, I like that. God is able to make all grace, and we can put inverted comma there, all grace meaning any various aspect of life and various need in all those different compartments, like marriage life, social life, personal life, spiritual life. There's many, work life. In every aspect, God is able to make all grace abound toward you. That means your complete life can be diving and swimming in grace. And then he says that you always having all sufficiency in all things, meaning that you're never lacking. You're never in a spiritual famine. You're never in a place where you have needs, but if you had the means, you could go forward, but you know that you can't go forward because you don't have the sufficiency. He says here, having all sufficiency in all things, every aspect of your life, raising your kids, your kids' life, their schooling, their mindset, their habits, their behaviors. And he says, having sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. So I'm going to read it quick now. It says, and God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you having all sufficiency in all things may have an abundance for every good work. So you just don't have things to meet your need, but you will have an abundance for other good works when you're helping other people. Now, the other thing that I want to say, and in next session, be ready, because I'm going to talk about how you can not just have access or live with your grace, but under somebody else's grace. So other picture that I will give you is that I see there's a poverty, and it's a poverty not just because there's no grace, but it's a poverty because there is no system to bring the grace. It's called configuration, right? So let me give you a picture in your mind as I end and wrap up this third session. Just picture this. you saw a beautiful piece of land next to a beautiful lake full of water, and you get a permit to build a house there, you build a house there, and everything is completed. The day comes when they hand over the key to you. As you open, you see the bathroom is beautiful, the kitchen is beautiful, you can see the pipeline, the wires of the electricity, everything is working, except as you open the shower to have a shower, you notice that there's no water coming out. So you call the person and say, sir, there's no water. And the person said, well, we have set all the piping system, everything is there, but except you have not connected your house, the piping system of your house, to the lake as you plan to use. So there have to be a pump, and there have to be pipeline that connect your pipeline to the pipeline of the lake. The same way, many people, they live next to grace in a church context or whatever it is, but grace is there, that's a lake, and your house is there, but there's no pipeline connected. So connectivity is the secret of a rich life spiritually. So I want to end here, and I trust that this teaching, this third session, added one more layer to what you understood about grace. So next session, as we do, we will talk about connecting to the grace in the life of another man who carries a higher grace, because God has configured his kingdom that way. So God bless you, and we'll see you very, very soon for the fourth session. And this is Suresh Guna.